Witam wszystkich słuchaczy audycji Koła Naukowego Publicystyki Politycznej Uniwersytetu Jagiellońskiego. Tak się złożyło, że w tym roku wyjechałem na stypendium do Wielkiej Brytanii w ramach programu Erasmus. Poznając tutejszą kulturę, nie sposób było jako student politologii nie zainteresować się wpływem Brexitu na tutejsze społeczeństwo. Szybko okazało się, że Brytyjczycy bardzo chętnie o Brexicie mówią, czego wynikiem jest także ten materiał. Udało mi się zorganizować rozmowę z profesorami z Wydziału Biznesu i Polityki Uniwersytetu w Hull, podczas której pytałem o skutki i nastroje związane z wyjściem Wielkiej Brytanii z Unii Europejskiej. Na moje pytania odpowiadają dziś dyrektor Centrum do Spraw Rządu Wielkiej Brytanii, dr Matt Beach, i były dyrektor Departamentu Polityki, profesor stosunków międzynarodowych, dr Justin Morris. Jeśli spodobał Wam się ten materiał, możecie pomyśleć nad zostawieniem subskrypcji, a także odsłuchaniem naszych pozostałych audycji. Jednocześnie zapraszam gorąco do śledzenia naszych social mediów, gdzie pojawiają się informacje o wszystkich nadchodzących materiałach oraz wydarzeniach. Dzięki! A teraz już całkiem na poważnie, zapraszam na rozmowę pod tytułem Różne Brexitu odcienie.
Do you think that was it overall good or bad that the United Kingdom left the European Union?
I believe it was a good decision. I think it was the right decision.
Okay, why so?
The United Kingdom has recovered its parliamentary sovereignty. This means that the members of parliament that we send to parliament every 5 years through a general election are now once again the sovereign authority in the United Kingdom. Before, when we were members of the European Union, we had a degree of pooled sovereignty. Like some of our sovereignty, if you can really divest and cut sovereignty up, and I'm not really sure you can, but that's like a theoretical question. We had sovereign authority in Parliament making some rules and some laws, but if that conflicted and collided with EU directives or EU law, then the EU law would take precedence. In other words, it would be supreme, and if there was a case to answer, it would be the European Court of Justice, which would be the highest court, as opposed to the British Supreme Court. So yes, I think it makes Britain an independent country in a meaningful sense, because we get to govern our own laws, and our highest court of the land is the final court. But also in particular, and directly connected to this, we can control the levels of mass low skill and no skill immigration from the EU, because obviously as EU citizens have free movement, as well as they can work anywhere, and there's freedom of goods and services and finance, but it's free movement. And that really was a bad deal for poorer, more working class British folk, especially in certain English regions. And so yeah, they're the reasons why I think it was good that we left. And I think even already you can see with the vaccine purchases and ordering of vaccines and everything, the British government was acting independently, and it acted quickly, and it got that aspect of the response to COVID right. It's got other aspects of the response to COVID quite wrong, but that it got right, and there's no guarantee, we would have got the medicines when we did, because at the time, our European cousins, Germany and France and Italy, were way behind. And so we've just had this huge global emergency where the most important thing is for government to keep its citizens as safe as possible. And we would not have had the vaccination level that we had. So I think that's a very clear data point, an example of what a sovereign independent United Kingdom can do. And I'm jolly glad of it.
Okay, Rizu, so basically you say that the the disadvantages aren't proportional to advantages, and the
Correct.
outcome was positive, right?
Yes.
Okay, so moving on. Actually, no, let me ask just one question. How then, basically, how to put it in the good words? now the United Kingdom is in the kind of economical crisis because of the shipments and the amount of workers, lack of it actually. And that's many say that's the reason of the Brexit. So is it like, was it worth it still to
Yes.
like, oh, okay. And
Yes, because for people like me, who is I'm a Eurosceptic and I voted to leave, as I've just set out, it wasn't an economic calculation. It was a political calculation.
okay.
It's about political control, political sovereignty. It's about having a meaningfully independent immigration policy. It's about saying that the British courts are the final authority in disputes. So mine is not an economic calculation. And I actually said in a number of debates and in a number of addresses that I made throughout the period, there could be recession, there could be short to medium term economic damage because we are coming out of a trading bloc that we have been part of for 43 years, with whom we have authored and co-authored lots of regulations. I don't accept, as a matter of fact, to be frank, that the shortages we're having are 100% because of Brexit. I think it's also because of lockdown and people leaving certain sectors on furlough. But you think the HGV drivers, we had a shortage before Brexit, we had a shortage before lockdown. People during lockdown have been furloughed. Many of these people who are in that profession were older men. A good number of them have decided not to re-enter the profession. So that's the first point. Yes, I think it is true we had some EU citizens who were doing those jobs as well, but Germany is still in the EU, and that has tens and tens of thousands of shortages in that sector. So I think this is a Europe-wide issue. I think if we're being perfectly frank, HGV drivers need to be paid more by companies. I think companies, particularly those who are selling goods, need to start paying their workers more, and therefore in the United Kingdom I'm talking about, and that will help to some extent to encourage British folk into those jobs that were previously filled by EU residents. But let's just not forget this. In 2015, the Oxford University Migration Laboratory, one of the leading research centres for numbers and on migration figures, in 2015 it said there were 3 million European Union residents in the UK. That was certainly data that I used and I cited in my publications. What we now know today is that 6 million EU residents, that's a doubling, 6 million in 6 years, doubling in 6 years, have signed up and officially registered with the government's settlement permanent residency program, which is absolutely fine. I've got no problem with that. It's great. And people come, pay tax, work hard, abide by the laws and make a contribution. That's super. But that just goes to show that in the intervening period, more people have wanted to come to this great country because it's free and tolerant and open, and generally speaking there's the rule of law, there's a market economy, but there's public services. So I don't think Brexit's been a bad thing. I think it's been a good thing already. Of course there will be bumps in the road. Look at Northern Ireland, the difficulty with the Northern Irish Protocol. Absolutely, for sure. But
Okay,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt.
First of all, before we begin, thank you very much that you agreed to do that with me. Second of all, we should begin. So do you think that was Brexit a good thing or a bad thing overall?
For the UK?
For the UK, yes.
Oh, I think it's a bad thing.
Why?
I think that it has negative economic consequences. I mean, you're talking about a trading bloc of 500 million people, which we've just disconnected ourselves from. And it seems to me that the arguments which are currently being put forward by government ministers that we're opening up new trading relations with, the ones they're citing at the moment, Australia, New Zealand, a number of issues there. Their economies are an absolute fraction of the size of the European Union economy, and last time I checked a map, they were on the other side of the world, whereas, we are literally 30 miles away from the coast of continental Europe. So, I know people say that geography is less significant nowadays, but actually when you're trading goods, it matters because you've got to move the things about. So, to me, the economic side of things I couldn't make sense of that economic argument. Maybe we'll come back to whether it was an economic argument in the first place a bit later, I don't know. And the other thing that I think it's done is I think it has diminished the UK's global standing, because we've previously benefited for a very long period of time from rather fortuitous, from a UK perspective, kind of pivotal position between Europe and the United States, and to some extent far less significant, but the Commonwealth countries as well. I don't think that's such an important issue as it once was, but and so I think we're less significant to the Americans because they used us as something of an inside voice within the European Union. Probably not as inside a voice as certain countries, perhaps France, would have suggested, but nevertheless, we of the larger European states, I think that the British were probably the most pro-Atlanticist, partly because they were cautious about Europe. So I think politically, economically, it's diminished us, and quite frankly, diplomatically, I think it's been catastrophic in terms of Britain's reputation. We signed a series of treaties after long negotiation. Within a matter of weeks, we were saying that they needed to be renegotiated and they weren't fair. The most recent comments about, well, we didn't think the European Union were actually going to implement them to the letter of the law. This is what treaties, this is what you do with treaties. And, the idea that a British government minister could have stood up in Parliament and said, yes, it will be a breach of international law, but it'll only be a minor breach. I just think for a country such as the UK, which has the generations that tried to build a reputation, rightly or wrongly, on the idea that it was a respecter and propagator of the rule of law, I just think it sends a very, very bad signal.
Yeah, but some people say, like the people that agreed with Brexit, say that it was more important to maintain sovereignty and independence, not to become more and more of a just another country in something bigger. You know what I mean?
Yeah, look, it's a trade-off. There were some very significant costs, including financial costs, associated with being a member of the European Union. The UK has been a net contributor for a long period of time, and many people might say that we've put in more than we got out, but I think it's extremely difficult to maintain that argument if you actually look at the improvement it provides for trade relations and so on. But was there a curtailment of sovereignty? Yeah, there's a curtailment of sovereignty associated with being a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. There's a curtailment of sovereignty associated with being a member of the United Nations. So you weigh those things up, and for me, the costs far outweigh the benefits of Brexit. I was, and still am, no fan of. I'm not what I would refer to as a Europhile. I think the European Union is profoundly faulty in a number of ways. I think there is a democratic deficit. I think there's a lack of accountability in terms of the manner in which the Commission operates. We all know, I think, the issues around difficulties getting auditors to pass its budgets and so on and so forth. So it's a fundamental. There's some fundamental problems with the European Union, and I think particularly and uniquely from a British perspective, for reasons which I can comment on if you wish, uniquely from a British perspective, I don't think the European Union was seen as being the deliverer of peace and democracy in the same way that it is amongst all the other European Union members, with the possible exception of Ireland. It's slightly different for Ireland.
So I just want to ask a question then. In which direction should be the independent UK heading right now to maintain the economical growth and the name of a great country?
When you say which direction, what directions do you have in mind?
Economical should be more labor-like, or should be like the liberal, and of course social ones. What European Union's law are maybe suitable still for the UK, and basically the whole political situation. What should be the next plans to maintain the economical stability and the growth, of course?
Okay, complicated question. Our current government, the Conservative government under Boris Johnson, is spending money like the most enthusiastic Labour governments. It really is the party of the economic centre left and the centre right simultaneously. So that tells you the interesting economic environment this Conservative government finds itself in. What do I think? Well, I believe in a market economy and free trade, and I think that's essential. But I don't believe in unbridled free markets in every sector. I believe in regulation, sensible regulation, and I believe in public services and a degree of a social safety net, what some people might call welfare policy. So I think broadly speaking, we've got that. I think broadly speaking, that should continue. I think on matters of economics, you need to sort of have a pragmatic approach, and you borrow from different traditions. But so that's what I'd say on that.
Okay, but what about the international relations with the EU members?
Yes, I think it's good that we maintain good diplomatic relationships with not just the European Union, but the constituent nations of the European Union, all of them, but especially with the largest nations, which have been our partners in the post-Second World War era, especially France and Germany and Italy, but all members, all 27 members of the EU. We need to keep good relations. I mean, this won't stop, and I think people forget the chief defensive alliance for European countries is NATO, and NATO, with the exception of Finland and Sweden, NATO is the absolute bedrock of defense and security against Russia. And we have NATO, which provides American money and American military support in a North Atlantic Treaty Partnership, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. So it's just not the case that leaving the EU will necessarily cause a split in NATO, because it's in nobody's interest. It's in no European country's interest to move away from this collective security pact in an era where we continue to have a rising Russia. People say the Cold War is over. I think the Russian bear hibernated for a few years. I don't think the Cold War was ever over. And so, yes, I don't see great problems between the United Kingdom and the main players in the EU, the main nations, because we have in common not just trade, but also collective security through NATO.
Okay, but now, how to put it, Brexit happened, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so now the European Union and the UK aren't as together as they used to be. So in which direction should be the United Kingdom heading now? What should they do as a country?
I think we have no choice but to try to build as strong a set of economic and diplomatic relations with the European Union as we can, because the geography and the size of the European market says everything. And the idea that that we won't be subject to European Union regulations. I mean, I'm no political economist, but when we export goods to the United States of America, those goods have to be compliant with US regulations, right?
Yeah.
And so when we export goods to the European Union, we will have to be compliant with European Union regulations on whichever goods it relates to. And that's true whether we're inside the Union or not.
So isn't that just a win-win situation? You maintain sovereignty and then you still have the...
Well, no, because we lose our open access to the market. So we still have to be compliant, but then in addition, we don't have the free access and all of the... So I think it's a lose-lose. Are we still compliant? We have to be, otherwise you can't sell your goods there, which is the same as any other country. I mean, this is one of the things I find remarkable. People say, well, why should the European Union have all of these regulations as to how things are produced and etc. Every single country that I'm aware of that trades internationally has those regulations. And you have to comply with them, otherwise you can't sell in that country's market. I mean, that's the whole point of being sovereign.
Yeah.
That's what those sovereign states are doing. So we will still have to be compliant with European Union regulations in terms of selling our goods there, and we will still have to sell our goods there because it is this extremely wealthy, extremely large market, which, by the grace of God or whoever you put it in the hands of, happens to be geographically our closest market. So we've still got to be compliant, but we pay extra costs now in order to access the market. I think it's lose-lose.
As you said, the UK leaving EU won't exactly damage the NATO because everyone will still maintain the good whatsoever relations. But then how do you think how the Brexit influenced the European Union as an institution? What happened? Like how to put it? Yeah, basically, what was the influence on the entire institution of UK leaving the EU?
I think Brexit was an existential crisis for the European Union, a crisis about existence. If one country could leave, and could leave based upon a democratic vote of its people, and then leave and do reasonably well, then that's a huge existential crisis for the European Union, which is a federal polity whose mission is we all do better together with a federal polity, closer economics, closer law, closer social arrangements, closer defence arrangements, proposals, European army, what have you. So a country leaving, especially a very significant country like the United Kingdom leaving, was a real threat to the idea of the EU, and it has encouraged Eurosceptics in other European countries.
So is it a good thing or a bad thing, you would say?
I don't want the European Union to collapse if the nations and the members of the European Union want to continue in federal alliance with one another, then I'm absolutely fine with that because I'm a Democrat. And I think that the vox populi, the voice of the people in Poland, in Austria, in the Czech Republic, in Italy, in Portugal, in Spain, wherever, ought to be obeyed by their political leaders. And so if people want to continue in the European Union, if it's in given member states' national interest to continue, that's fine by me. I don't want to see the whole house burnt down. Why would I? Why would I? But if countries choose to leave, so be it.
Okay, yeah. So we've established that the UK didn't benefit from leaving the
Certainly not
EU.
in my view.
But how about the EU as a whole? How did the Brexit influence the European Union, you think? How did that...
I think it has negative consequences for the European Union as well. I think, for starters, it diminishes the heft of the organisation. They just lost a country of 70 odd million people, the fifth largest, well, depending on how you measure it, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh largest economy in the world, but nevertheless an extremely large economy. The most significant financial market in the world, at least currently. Who knows what the future will bring? So a very, very major economic and diplomatic player. I think we were able to, at least when we had a competent government, we were able to bridge certain diplomatic and cultural gaps between the European Union and the United States. It's difficult to see who steps into that position now. I think that weakens the European Union. And I think the other thing that, ironically, the British did, which to my view would be helpful, or was helpful for the European Union, was that it served as a break against the most integrationist aspects of the European Union. So amongst the European Union bureaucracy and certain national leaders, those who have been pushing for ever closer union, and this is where I don't like the European Union, to me that has always been an elitist project. And it's not true, in my opinion, that it was only really the British that were concerned about this. If you look, the first job I had when I began working here as a research student was we then had a professor of European politics here, a woman called Professor Juliet Lodge, who was a big, big name in European politics. 2 years previously, she'd been voted Woman of Europe by the European Commission, and a big, big name in European politics. And the first job I had here was to work as her research assistant, just pulling together news reports on the Maastricht Treaty, right? So we're going back somewhere now.
Okay.
People forget, okay, the UK never got to vote on Maastricht because the government thought that the government was pro-treaty and they didn't think they'd get it past the public. Ireland voted against it, against the Maastricht Treaty, and was invited to vote again, which it did, and on the second occasion it passed, and that one was considered to be the okay vote. I think Denmark voted against and was invited to vote again, and did. In France, so allegedly the most pure, one of the most pro-European of all EU member states, the Maastricht Treaty passed, I can't remember if it was by 0.1 or 0.3 of 1%.
Okay.
It was 50.1 versus 49.9, or it might have been 50.3 versus 49.7, I can't quite remember. In other words, it was on an absolute knife edge. And in Germany, the government refused to allow a referendum. Why? Because they thought they would lose it.
Okay.
They didn't think there would be public support for the treaty. So I think this idea that publics across Europe are hugely in favour of a European integrationist model, and it's just the Brits that aren't, I think that's a complete misreading of it. And I think the British government served, for my mind, because I wouldn't wish to see integration in the way that some European bureaucrats and political leaders would, I think the British government served a positive role in restraining some of those more extreme aspects of the European integration kind of project. And that has gone. And if you look at views towards the European Union in Poland,
we'll catch up on that.
A number of the other Eastern European members, in the Netherlands, in Germany, although of course the problem in Germany is it's most closely associated with the far right, and for historical reasons that's very, very difficult kind of political terrain. There's a lot of, I was going to call it the National Front, but I forgot what they've rebranded themselves as in France. It's no longer the Front National, is it? They've changed the name. But anyway, but there's a problem there because it's associated with the far right. But I don't think these are just far right sentiments. I think that a lot of people have got a strong national identity that they want to preserve within a European context.
Okay, yeah. So what you're saying basically is just that we shouldn't be looking at anti-EU people only as far rights, right?
No, absolutely. I think that there's a very significant popular caution about European integration. I don't think it belongs simply to the far right. I think it suits some people to portray it as such, but I don't think it is. And in fact, actually, it traditionally was the left that were concerned about the European Union because they saw it as being a big kind of capitalist conspiracy. So actually, traditionally, the objections have come from the left. In this country, the Bennite left, the hard left that was associated with Tony Benn in the 70s, 80s, somewhere through into the 90s. I mean, they were vehemently anti-EU because they saw it as being a capitalist venture. So I think this idea that, which some politicians kind of fit the bill for, so the Farages, so it's easy to paint Farage as a far-right nutcase, quite frankly. To some extent, I think he is a far-right nutcase. I would never vote for him if he was the only person on the ballot paper, personally. But I don't think all people who are concerned about the European Union adopt those political viewpoints at all. I think it's much more broadly based. And my point about Britain's departure from the EU being problematic for the EU is that voice, that cautionary voice that the British probably championed more than any other. I think that's been lost now to a large extent, obviously. And as a consequence, I think there's a danger that the European, I don't like this language of elite and the rest of the world, the rest of the community, but I think you get my point that cadre of people in the political elite who are pushing the project forward, I think there's a danger that they become increasingly disconnected, from the people that they allegedly represent, and I think that potentially is a massive problem.
Okay, so how would you describe, what would you think about the whole future of the European Union now? How is it gonna turn out?
Blimey, that's a big question. Well, I'm not sure anybody quite knows, put it like that. What do you feel? I don't think it's going to be a kind of Mearsheimer-esque disintegration, etc., etc. I don't think that is going to be the case. Although interestingly, when you've seen the European Union really pushed, so the financial crisis of 2007-8, you did see the kind of, it didn't take long for nationalist splinterings to start to kind of emerge.
Yeah, for sure. Yes.
The language that you saw most pronounced, I suppose, in Greece against, well, this is just Germany trying to do what it's always wanted to do. We were quite rapidly back into some of the worst kind of nationalist rhetoric that we've seen in decades ago. It didn't take long for that to come to the fore. And that's my point about losing Britain and therefore not having somebody to voice this cautionary position. I think is really dangerous for the European Union. So my fear is that, because I think that the project has got a lot going for it, my fear is that those who sit atop the project will continue to try and push it in an ever more integration-ready direction, and I think that will slowly separate the institution and those who champion it from the people who live within it, and I think potentially that could be destabilising. And my real fear, I suppose, is because my politics are not the politics of the right by any stretch of the imagination. My real fear is that actually that opens up space for the Le Pens and the Farages and those who are of the right to actually push an agenda which I think could be massively disruptive for Europe. So I think there could be some real difficult times ahead, unless those who are at the top of the European project actually curtail their own desires and actually look at what the populations around Europe are saying.
So what is it saying?
I think it's saying that they like many of the benefits that come with the European Union, freedom of movement, trade, a general increase in everybody's standards of living. I think those things people embrace, but I think that the kind of homogenizing liberal, in inverted commas, agenda, which is contrary to many of the traditions and cultures of some EU member states now, or at least they interpret what liberal means in a different way to the way that I think it's interpreted in the context of the European Union. If we go back to Poland or Hungary or some of the other Eastern European states, I don't share the views of those people within those countries who have concerns about gay marriage or various, but these are many of these communities are communities that are still deeply religious, very traditional and so on. Well, I'm not religious and I wouldn't consider myself to be traditional, but I do respect the right of other people to be religious and traditional if that's what they want to do, and I just wonder whether the European Union does respect that. And I think when it pushes that direction, so the social side of things, I think that's when it starts to create friction between the institution and the population.
Okay, so let me jump to the straightly to the next question. That because you mentioned many Eurosceptical countries, at least those countries who have Eurosceptical communities. Let's just put it that way. So, have you heard anything about the Pole exit situation?
Yes.
And what do you think about it?
I think the European Union needs to show the government of Poland more respect. I think the European Union needs to show the Polish judiciary more respect. I think there needs to be a reduction in sharp rhetoric by the European Commission, especially Ursula von der Leyen. And I think they need to be diplomatic and understanding and move forward with a degree of grace.
Okay, but don't you think that this diplomatic approach should be coming from both sides at the same time, not only European Union? Like, because you said that especially the president of EU should be be more friendly in the words, let's just put it that way. But we still, as a nation, also have said some things that aren't that appropriate. I think, especially our Prime Minister lately, who basically accused the World War III happening because of the European Union. So, what do you think about that?
Things should be said face to face behind closed doors, and then different political rhetoric can be delivered in public forums. I just think that the European Commission is responding in a very robust way publicly with public statements, partly because of what's happened with Brexit. And I'm not sure that's the best way to do it. I think the best way to proceed is to praise the nation states, remind the nation states of what has been achieved collectively together by membership of the European Union, and also show respect to the democratically elected national governments, not to give really quite sharp rhetoric where you're speaking to them as if you're their teacher and they're the young pupils in the classroom. That's how it sounded to me. So that's what I'd say on the issue.
Okay, totally understandable. What I wanted to ask you is more of like still regarding the Poland membership in the European Union and connecting it with the Brexit. Like, do you think that the countries that have weaker economics than the United Kingdom would be actually able to leave the European Union right now? Aren't they too addicted to European money, basically?
I'm not sure I would say addicted to money, but I know what you mean. The European Union redistributes its funds from richer members to poorer members, and so therefore it is less smooth for smaller economies, less developed European economies to make that decision and seek to withdraw from a federal polity which does give them extra money and trade advantages. But that said, for Britain, if we look at the one case study we have of a proper exit of the European Union, and a successful one to some extent. Now, of course, Britain's economy might go downhill, but then again, we're in the pandemic, and so that's unsurprising. But at the moment, whilst inflation is about 3% or what have you, growth, the economy is growing. We're not in recession, the economy is growing, and so that's one positive sign. I think ultimately, what lesson countries, especially Poland, but other countries that have Eurosceptic populations and communities in, what they can learn is when they look at the United Kingdom, most people who voted to leave, it wasn't an economic calculation. Actually, many people who voted to remain, it was an economic calculation. And it's the strongest argument, I think, to remain, an economic stability argument. It's more of a cautious, or like a small c conservative argument, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. So I think, but for many, many people, it was about heart. It was, is my country being run by our democratically elected representatives? What sort of country do we want? And then also very rational things. Look, the court system doesn't work. We want British judges to be the final court. And the big thing in the public mind, the big policy issue was, how do we get control of mass low skill and no skill migration, which is having downward pressure on the lowest paid in our economy. Now, that was a big issue for lots of people. So it was a mixture of heart and head, emotion and reason. So the people who said we'll vote leave, when they've been surveyed, the economy wasn't the top issue. So it can be a reason to leave, but you've got to be careful and you've got to weigh it all up. And I think the fact that Britain was a bigger economy did help, but also that means there are lots more people who need jobs. So it's not a guarantee that leaving is going to be economically the right thing. But to be perfectly frank, what saved the leave cause, the exit cause, was the fact that most people who voted leave weren't voting along economic rationalism. They were voting about sovereignty, as I said, and immigration, and patriotism, and what sort of country they wanted Britain to be, and what sort of country they remembered Britain had been. Yeah.
Okay, so since we're a little running out of time, I'll kind of stop us both right now. And yes, you've answered all of my questions very, I think, in satisfying way, I think. And yes, thank you very much for meeting me today and having us a short of a conversation. And I won't be taking more of your time than for today.
Well, it was very nice to meet you, Alexander. I'm very glad that we can have this interview.
From this perspective that you have, from your perspective, do you think that it is possible that Poland would leave European Union or get, air quotes, kicked out?
I don't think it'll get kicked out. I think the institution. I mean, we've seen the recent letter from the French Prime Minister to Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, saying that Britain needs to be. I don't think he does actually say punished, but anyway, there have to be costs associated with Brexit. So I don't think that they'll be kicking anybody out, because the last thing they want to do is to see states. Poland's a significant European player as well. I mean, this is the other point, that of the East European states that joined, Poland is, it seems to be, the most significant in terms of population size, political clout, and so on. So I don't think it's going to get thrown out. I doubt very much, and here your knowledge may be better than mine, I suspect it almost certainly is. From what I understand it, I don't think there's a genuine widespread kind of clamour for Poland to leave. Having said that, there wasn't initially in Britain.
And that's what I wanted to say right now.
Yeah, and that's the problem. So do I think Poland is going to leave within the next 3 years? No. Do I think Poland might be seriously, and not just Poland, but Hungary possibly, and Romania? Do I think that they might be questioning their position within it? Not the government necessarily, but their people. It depends whether they've got a nationalist government or popular government. Might they be more rigorously questioning it in 15 years, 20 years time? Yeah, I think they possibly could be. And again, that brings me back to the point about when Britain was in there. Britain acted as a brake on some of the things that the countries that you're referring to there find least palatable. I mean, we always pushed for the idea of the European Union being an economic union more than a social union.
Yes.
And I think that as the further you push the social union side of things. But I don't think they'll break, and I don't think they'll break away. Partly, so maybe Mearsheimer has got this bit right, partly because they see strength and security in the European Union, and obviously NATO as well, from the shadow that is cast by Russia, which is still significant.
Yeah.
This is my point about the identity thing, you see, about Britain never identifying with the European Union in the same way that all the other member states, with the possible exception of Ireland, did. If you think of how all of the members of the EU came to become members of the European Union, they were either emerging from a period of right-wing dictatorship, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, Franco Spain, same in Portugal, or they were defeated during the Second World War, France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, etc. Or, on the eastern side, they were escaping from Soviet control. So for all of those countries, the European Union offers, or there's a direct tie for all of those countries between their freedom and prosperity compared to their past. The only exception is Britain, because we weren't under the Soviet yoke, we weren't defeated, we weren't a right-wing dictatorship. So Britain, so my view is that in the political culture of the Brit, we've never ever seen the European Union as the provider of security, because with classic British arrogance and quite often a misreading of history, the view in Britain has always been, we don't need the European Union to keep us safe from dictatorship or from invasion or anything, because we've always been able to do it ourselves.
Yeah, because
we were an island and we didn't get defeated, and we're, etc., etc., etc. Right? So that's the narrative that plays. So Ireland is the only one who doesn't quite fit my model. It depends if you think whether Ireland thinks that to some extent the European Union provides it with a degree of security. I don't mean in the sense of military security, but an ability to push back against Britain, because clearly that relationship historically is a relationship where Ireland has been to some extent dominated by Britain. So the European Union levels that out a little bit. So Ireland, it doesn't quite fit the model, but I do think that this is a big, big part of it. The fact that in Britain, for those historical reasons I've just outlined, we just don't see the European Union as we never did, as anything beyond an economic project.
Okay.
Whereas for those other member states, it was clearly an economic project, but it was also a security project, it was a social project, etc. And I think that's the mismatch.
Okay, so coming back to Mearsheimer again, you would say that these, would you say even, that these thoughts of getting out of the EU are getting more and more like against the European Union laws? Would it be because what Mearsheimer says, the Second World War happened so far ago?
Yeah, I think, well, again, this plays differently, I think. So it's easier for states that have been within the European Union from the beginning or from the early days to forget what the darker days looked like, because it's a long while ago and memories fade. And we've talked about this in classes in some of the discussions. Jervis talks about this and so on.
Yes.
Of course, the memory for the Eastern European member states of the EU is a much more recent memory. They're only 30 some years into being escaping,
or even less.
Yeah. So and for there's always been a degree. There's always been a degree of Russian or Soviet influence in a lot of those Eastern European states, and to some extent that still is still there. But I think the more that the European Union can be depicted by those who want to depict it in this way as a threat to traditional values and so on, the more space it opens up for the Putins of this world to say, well, look, that's what a liberal model does, that's what the European Union's all about, whereas, you can have your traditional values. Now, I don't think he necessarily believes a word of it, but in a strategic argument, it makes a lot of sense for certain people to use that kind of rhetoric. And I think there's a danger that the European Union is to some extent playing into the hands of the people who want to use that kind of language.
Okay. Oh, that's a little dark scenario, wouldn't you say that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I think on this dark hand we will end our official conversation right now.
Okay.
Since I've run out of the main questions.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for...
I tell you what I would say, just before... If you go back to one of the first people we started talking about in the module that you're doing at the moment, and if you think of Carr,
yes,
I think that Carr's observation is a really good. So his model, you can get a lot of leverage thinking about the European Union. So does that ruling elite that is pushing the European project forward, do they think that they are acting in accordance with absolute and universal principles for the good of everybody? I'm sure they do, right? I'd be very surprised if they're not. The problem is, that's their version of utopia and only their version of utopia. It's not a universal version of utopia. And so, as Carr would use it, I think what we need is some of the tools of realism to break it down and say, actually, look, to some extent this is, to use his exact language, a hollow and intolerable sham.
yeah.
And I think there's something that Carr could. I think Carr's I think 20 Years Crisis is a stunningly good book, and I think that way of thinking about it might actually help people think a little bit more carefully about what the European Union is saying and doing.
Okay, yeah, I think so as well. So yes, thank you very much.
You're
for
very,
having
very
this
welcome.
conversation with
You're
me.
very welcome.
Jak widać, mimo że od Brexitu minął już prawie rok, to wszelkie obawy z nim związane nadal są obecne w społeczeństwie, jak również i poglądy ów Brexit wychwalające. Jedno jest pewne. Nadal jest za wcześnie, by jednoznacznie stwierdzić, czy wyjście Wielkiej Brytanii z Unii Europejskiej wyszło komukolwiek na złe, bądź dobre, ale nie ulega wątpliwości, że jest to jeden z największych kryzysów w historii istnienia Unii i już na zawsze zapisze się na kartach historii. Dziękuję Państwu za uwagę i zapraszam na kolejne audycje.